Hey everyone, welcome to the Illumineers Quest podcast where we talk everything Lorcana. I'm Zach.
And I'm Jacob.
Thanks for coming on this journey with us. So today's episode's a fun one. We're going to talk about the tips and tricks for beginners that we've learned over our first week of play.
Yeah, we've learned quite a bit, I'd say.
We thought we were becoming experts, I would say, in the beginning. We knew we had a lot to learn, but we had studied a ton. However, we finally got our hands on cards. We finally got to do some starter deck battles, our first league matches on starter decks. We started building our own decks. And when we started building our own decks, boy, were we in a rude awakening at that point.
Yes.
We thought we knew a lot, and we were wrong.
Yes, that's for sure. And we'll get into all that here in this episode.
Yeah, so this should cover some of the roadblocks that we came across, some of the other things that you, as a beginner, might not consider. You know, the big things I think that a new player will look at is ink cost, strength and willpower, lore that a card gives you, consider action and items to round out a deck, and maybe, just maybe, start scratching the surface on abilities and secondary attributes of cards. But that's where you really get into the nitty-gritty of building a good, strong, well-rounded deck. Would you agree with that one?
Yes.
So I think today we can talk a little bit about some of the basics, but mainly this is going to be the next level down. You know, getting into those next level tips and tricks that you might want if you get stuck and you don't know where to go or how to change your deck up if you keep getting beat.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
So to start this off, I think it's on the surface pretty straightforward. But when you really start to get into the theory of the game, and we found out pretty quickly that lighter decks or having decks where you make sure you have enough small cost cards to play early on is really important.
And I think this is honestly like one of the biggest tips to give, because I found like my first few decks I was stuck. I was like, this just isn't working out. And then I just started making like little decks with like a lot of littler cards, and it just started working out.
So what we mean by that is our lighter decks or littler decks is low ink cost cards.
Yeah.
So again, as just a quick recap for people that may not have played a game yet, on your turn, you get to draw one card and you get to ink one card. There's obviously exceptions to the inking, where if you have a cards that allow you to ink more, or a card with an ability that allows you to ink an additional card. But in general, you're going to only be able to ink one card. And especially from the beginning, all of those cards that grant you more ink cost more than one. So if you don't have any one ink cost cards, you're not playing a card on your first turn. You can ink a card, and then that's it. And so if you have a deck with no one or two cost cards, then you can ink on your first two turns and then play on your third turn. And at that point, your opponent potentially could have two cards on the board. They could have a one cost card and a two cost card, maybe even three one cost cards. So making sure you're on the lighter side is important to getting out to a strong start. You know, I think we would agree that creating a deck with all one cost cards or two cost cards is probably not the right way. But the tip is to make sure that you have a couple one cost cards or a couple two cost cards so that you know you're going to be able to play your first or second turn. Also, with the ability to reshuffle, if you will, at the beginning of the game. You know, so you draw 7 cards. If you don't like 2 of them, or you don't like your hand in general, you can choose 2 of them to put to the bottom of the deck, draw 2 more to try to get to a place where you can start out strong. Care to add anything?
I agree with everything you said.
Okay. That's fine. We can keep going. I think that, and I've mentioned this before too, but people that have played Marvel Snap will definitely understand this, you know, paradigm of how to play the game, because it's the exact same in Marvel Snap, where you start off with 1 energy, and so you can only play a card that costs 1 on your first turn. Then you get 2 energy your second turn. And so the same thing works with this. You build up your ink slowly over time. So by your third or fourth or maybe even fifth hand or fifth turn, then you're to the point where you can start to really play the more powerful cards. But you have to build up to that, and you have to, if your strategy is to play a heavier deck, then you have to make sure that your opponent isn't running away with the game before you can get to that. So you have to still have lighter cards in there to deal with their lighter cards before the game runs away from you.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things too is like if you fill the board up with lots of lighter cards, there's only so many times that your opponent can challenge and attack. So that's
fair.
As they're challenging your cards, you can just keep questing.
Yeah, and that's the benefit I think of going first versus second or vice versa. If you're first, you don't get to draw a card, and so I've kind of hedged on going second because I like having more cards in my hand. But if you're first, you're in the driver's seat. So if you have a 1-cost card and you're questing, the other person can either quest or they can challenge, and if they're challenging, then they're getting behind because they're spending their time challenging versus questing, and if they're questing, they're always going to be one behind. So getting out to a quick start, especially if you go first, is a key point to make.
For sure.
Okay. So secondly, having abilities and dealing with tank characters.
Yes.
So there's kind of two ways that I think are like the overarching strategies that you can deal with tanks. The first one is you have abilities on your characters that can deal with or help deal with tanks. There's usually not a card that it's rare for a card to be able to like punch above its weight, and you have a 6 or 7 cost card that will be taken out by a 2 or 3 cost card.
Yeah.
Challenger is an ability that will help you with that, where if you challenge another card, that card gets higher strength. So that's one way to deal with it. That's an ability that will help.
Yeah.
There are a couple cards that have abilities that can just banish characters if they're banished too. We talked about this in our ink tier list, like Cusco, for instance, on Emerald. If he gets banished, he banishes the character that challenged him as well. So you can deal with them in a few ways. The second way would be actions and items.
Yep.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I'd say the biggest one that comes to mind for me is Dragonfire, because that's a way to instantly banish anything that you want on your opponent's board, unless they have something like Ward going on. But other than that, you're not really afraid of anything with Dragonfire.
We talked about that too. Dragonfire is a Ruby card, 5 cost.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have, for instance, Maui.
Yeah.
He's in Steel. He's an 8 cost.
He's literally the biggest tank card stat-wise in the game.
And Dragonfire is a 5 cost. So if you have, as a player, enough ink to play Maui, they've definitely got enough ink to play 5 and probably more to spare. Just right off the rip, before your ink can even dry, they're Dragonfiring you and he's gone. So that's why Ward's important, as Jake mentioned, to kind of deal with some of those. If you're building up a tanky deck, you probably want a card with Ward.
Yeah, I think...
Or I would strongly consider having Aurora.
Yeah, I think for sure, because it protects you. It helps keep your stuff safe, basically.
Yeah, so the Aurora Sapphire card is a card that grants all of the other characters on the board Ward, which, again, Ward disallows other opponents or your opponent from directly calling them out for anything. So Aurora Dreaming Guardian is the one that we're referencing.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondarily, I think there are a lot of cards in Steel, which again we touched on in our tier list. If you haven't listened to that one yet, that'd probably be a good one to listen through as well. The Steel ink type has a lot of direct dealing damage items and actions. So fire your cannons, raise your sword, smash, the blaster from Lilo and Stitch. There's a lot of cards that just deal direct damage. So if you have a low cost card that's, call it 3 or 4 ink, that does a decent amount of damage, but you have a really tanky character you're going up against, if you pair that with an action or item, then you probably can punch above your weight enough to get that character out. And so that's kind of the way to deal with both sides. We talked about lighter decks being not lighter decks in general, but having lighter or low cost cards in your deck being important. If you want to build a tanky deck, then you just have to be aware of those things that might get thrown your way, like actions and items and the abilities that they might have to hurt you.
Yeah, you have to be aware of those counters when you're making any deck, really, but especially with tanky cards.
And the other downside to tanky characters or tanky cards is, again, we talked about on the previous tip on building decks with light cards in them, is if you have like Aladdin Heroic Outlaw, which might be my favorite card, love the art, love the ability, love the stats of the card, love the shift ability.
Yep.
It's 7 cost straight up, 5 cost on the shift. So even if you're shifting, you're not doing that until 4 or 5 turns in. And you're not doing it until 4 turns in if you have other cards from Sapphire that are allowing you to get ink faster. And so it's very hard to get a bunch of those cards out there and get them on the board where they can be beneficial to you.
Yep.
So you don't want to go overly heavy.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I think the next tip that we have is kind of a shot at ourselves.
Yes. Yeah.
When we were reading through the card decks pre-release and we watched a few of like Ryan Miller's videos with the community on getting people up to speed on how to play the game, one of the things that we thought would be really cool would be stacking ink fast.
Yep.
Again, touched on this in the ink tier list. We thought stacking ink and having a ton of cards from Sapphire that add ink to your inkwell really quick would be incredibly overpowered, and it's not.
It's not. No, it's basically the main counter to it is you're taking all these turns and using all these cards to build up your ink, and your opponent could very well be already halfway to 20 lore.
Well, and you're kind of countering yourself, because if your main function is to stack ink, then you're losing cards in your hands too.
Mm-hmm.
If you play Tala and you play Mickey Mouse Detective and you play One Jump Ahead, which are the 3 main ink building cards from there.
I'd throw Fishbone Quill in there as well.
Fishbone Quill allows you to take a card out of your hand.
Mm-hmm.
So Fishbone Quill, for instance, takes 2 cards. It takes that card itself and another card from your hand that you want to ink into your inkwell. So that's 2 cards out of your hand. One Jump Ahead is 1 card out of your hand into your inkwell. So it's basically just turning that card into ink, because it goes out of your hand into your discard, turns it into ink, takes a card off of the top of your deck into your inkwell. And then same thing with Mickey Mouse Detective. It takes a card out of your hand, and then you get to put the top card of your deck into your inkwell.
Mm-hmm. And
so you're using a lot of cards to get that ink into your inkwell, which is great in theory, but what we didn't consider was that you run out of cards very quick.
Yep.
When you run out of cards, you're at the mercy of your deck being in good shape. So if you, for instance, are playing Sapphire Ruby or Sapphire Steel and you get Aladdin Heroic Outlaw, or you get Giant Tink, or you get Maui, then that's fantastic. If you draw Flounder or the base Aurora, that's 2 cost from Sapphire, you're in trouble.
Yep, 100%.
The other opportunity with that is to play Amethyst, so like a Sapphire Amethyst, and hopefully draw a bunch of cards to offset the ink that you're building. But again, to your earlier point, your opponent might just be going crazy questing and building ink building lore as you're doing this, and so you might be behind 6 or 7 ink by the time your strategy's starting.
Yeah, and that goes back to our first tip: is lighter decks seem better, and those, I think, as people figure out the game, will get more and more play. And I just think as the more that happens, the more Sapphire gets left behind. I think
you have more value on your first 2 or 3 turns with lighter decks, and with Sapphire, it tends to make you want to play heavier decks because you're building that ink.
It just takes you longer to get going.
Correct. So, kind of a good transition there. So, along with, like we said, the building ink, you want to draw cards. Drawing cards and adding cards to your deck or to your hand seems to be super OP.
Yes, 100%. I think obviously Amethyst is the number one ink for that. I think it just obviously just screams like we draw cards, I think it's the best for that, and I've been playing lots of Amethyst, and it drawing cards, you just have so much to play, you're never running out.
Yeah, and so again, like we said with the Sapphire deck 2 seconds ago, you can run out of cards really fast. So we'll take you through the first couple hands here, or your first couple turns. Mm-hmm. You start with 7 cards. We'll say you're the first turn, so you have 7 cards. You don't get to draw a card that first turn. You ink a card. You play a 1-cost card. Mm-hmm. You now have 5 cards in your hand. Turn 2, you ink a card, or you draw a card. So you are at 6 cards, but then you ink a card and you play a card. So now you're at 4 cards.
Yep.
Turn 3, you draw a card, so you're at 5 cards. Let's say you ink a card and you play 2 cards this time because you have 3 or 4 ink. So you have a lot of ink now that you can play. Maybe not just a 1 or a 2 or 3-cost card. Maybe you play a 1 and a 2 or something along those lines. So you're down to 2 cards in your hand, 3 turns in.
Yep.
So if you have a card that will draw you cards, so like Maleficent is probably one of my favorite cards. It's Maleficent Sorceress. She costs 3, and when played, she draws a card.
Yeah.
So you play a card, but then you instantly replenish it.
Yeah. So
the point of that is to say, again, after 3 turns, maybe 4 turns, depending on how you're playing, you're really low on cards. So you need to be able to replenish it, which is, again, why we think Amethyst is so good and why the strategy is really strong.
Yeah, go back to the tier list video to see where we rank Amethyst, and I think that tells you also how much we think drawing cards is just super great.
It is. And again, this is probably the 3rd time I'll say it now, as we talked about on the Sapphire side, if you have no cards in your hand and you're at the mercy of what's on the top of your deck, you're probably in trouble.
Yeah. Because
you have 60 cards in a deck, and if you're hoping for 1, maybe 2 cards, that's 8 cards out of 60. That's right over 10% chance of getting what you need. And if you've already had to ink one of those cards, maybe, you had one in your initial hand, didn't want to use it super early on because it was a higher cost card, so you ink it. Now you're down to, 6 or 7. So you're right at 10% chance of having the card you need. So it's unreliable. You can't rely on you having the card at the top of the deck that you need. So drawing cards keeps you from running into that problem. And then kind of in conjunction with some of the stuff we've talked about with the stacking the ink and the drawing the cards and keeping the ball rolling, are all the expensive characters overrated? Like, just in general, like, is some of these cards, that from a collector standpoint and from a flashy, like, set standpoint seem really cool. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is the legendary Maleficent. She costs 9. Mm-hmm. How do you ever, have you ever played, so we said on an earlier episode, we've played 30 to 40 games each. How many of those games have you gotten to where you've had 9 ink in your inkwell?
The highest cost card I've ever played was 7.
I think I would agree with that. I think the highest I've played is 7 as well, and
that rarely happens.
And it might have just been, I don't even know if I played, and I'm sure you're talking about Aladdin Heroic Outlaw.
Yes.
I've played Aladdin Heroic Outlaw. I don't know if I've played him straight up. I think I've shifted him when I've played him.
That could also be true.
So I think the highest cost card I've played is 6. Okay. So you have to, if you're playing a 9-cost Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, where when you play this character, you banish another character, which is basically Dragonfire.
Yep.
What does your mid-game look like? Because early on, if your goal is to get to Maleficent, you have to do something to attack the other people or to attack your opponent early on, so that they're not at 14 lore when you're at 3, because all you've been doing is trying to get to Maleficent.
Yep.
What is your so you have to attack early on, you have to stay at pace early on. So what does the mid game look like? Like, what are you doing in the mid game? Just using items to try to keep their characters off the board?
I think so. I mean,
but again, that's best case scenario, right?
And obviously, I think this Maleficent card is very. I mean, this is the extreme.
It's incredibly powerful. Don't get me wrong, but you also have like Gantu, which that's a terrible example, but because he's at 8 ink and he's just kind of a really bad card. Like Mickey Mouse, Brave Little Tailor, he's evasive at 8 with 4 lore, so that's a really good card too. But still, it's 8 ink. Like, how do you get to 8 ink?
Yeah. And
stay in the game to get there?
Yeah, I rarely see that expensive of a card ever in a game.
I think you have the strategy if you want to play a heavy card, if you want to play Brave Little Tailor, Mickey Mouse, you have to just like end the game with him. You have to somehow use him and have Rush or something to play him quest in the game, because I don't see a world where your mid game, so call it rounds like 3 through 6, stay at pace with your opponent or close enough with your opponent to where you get this card and have Rush to get him going to win. Because again, we talked with Dragonfire, we talked with Steel. You have other abilities that can knock him down really quick. So it's a huge risk. It's a massive risk to play something on one turn, one card that expensive.
I just think in most cases that I've seen, it's not worth it.
The game is almost decided by that point. Mm-hmm. Because you can, so again, you play 1 ink per turn. Let's just say you stay down that path. So you can play him at the earliest at turn 8.
Yep. And
if you've played other cards before that, your hand's depleted.
Completely.
You've played 8 ink. You've played, call it 5 or 6 other cards. You're in trouble. I mean, it's that simple.
Yep. And more likely than not, your opponent has just so many cards on the board at that time because you're not really dealing with them. They're winning the game. They probably already won.
That's most likely the case. I mean, the only like theoretical way I can see that this would happen is if you've done a really good job of building up your ink fast with a potential Sapphire deck of some sort. Mm-hmm. But that's like best case scenario, and so like best case scenario, you get him out turn 5 maybe.
Yeah.
But then you have to hope that your opponent doesn't have Dragonfire. And if they don't, he's got 5 willpower, 5 strength, and so he's not that hard to take out. There are a lot harder cards. So I think that it's a best case scenario strategy. I don't think you can bank on the high cost cards winning you the game.
Yeah, and I think this, like we're talking about 8 and 9, I think that even 6 or 7 also, not as much, but also is also in this talk here, is conversation as well, because I just think that even though it's turn 6 and 7, it's still kind of the same thing. It's still, your opponent is still running away with the game, basically.
Yeah, and I think there are like really tanky characters like Gantu or Maleficent or Hades. Elsa even is getting there. You can only attack 1 per turn, so like if you want to challenge one character, if there was an ability, I mean, I know there's Rush and there's a couple one like what's the Ruby card that lets you ready?
Oh, it's LeFou and Fan the Flames.
Fan the Flames. I couldn't think of it. Yeah. So if you have a Fan the Flames that lets you ready the card back up again to attack again, then maybe. But if your strategy is to do that, then again, like we're already talking getting him on the board at 5 or 6, and now you're talking 6 or 7. You're just challenging to deal with the cards your opponent has already built up.
Yep.
If we're wrong here, please let us know.
Yeah.
Because I would love to play Little Tailor Mickey.
Yeah, me too.
Or Mickey Little Tailor. on there. I would love to play Maleficent. We just have not come up with a way that it makes sense to have those in your deck.
No, not even close.
And lastly, but not least, we touched on this on our tier list episode as well. The healing ability, or the healing in the game, there are a couple cards that have like healing abilities. There's a couple items that heal,
primarily
or
amber,
remove damage. Yeah, primarily in the amber ink. Are we misunderstanding that, or is that just really not that useful?
I think it isn't. I think that's the short answer. Is it isn't that useful.
I think that's fair, and I tried a healing deck, and I tried to understand it, and I'm getting there where I think I'm starting to understand a couple like combinations of synergies that might work. But we said this in the tier list as well, and we go into it a little bit deeper. The healing ability has to be very proactive. You can't reactively heal.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is if you are attacked, meaning your opponent challenges you, there's a 50-50 chance that they just wipe your card out.
Mm-hmm.
Or they maybe, if you have a strong card, attack that card with 2 of theirs and do take it out.
Yes.
And so the healing ability, you can't rely on your opponent allowing you to heal. You have to devise a strategy where you attack them and then you heal that character or card that you just attacked or challenged with.
I think that's absolutely the best way to control it. I think reactively healing is just too unpredictable, and really your opponent is controlling what you heal at that point. You don't know what he's going to challenge. You might have a good idea, but you really are just figuring it out as you go. You
have to control the narrative on the healing.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to do.
Yes.
And some of those healing cards cost a lot as well. I mean, there's Dinglehopper, for shout out Ariel and Little Mermaid, which will remove 1 damage every turn.
Mm-hmm.
But 1 damage isn't going to out-heal most cards.
Yeah.
Most cards, unless they're a 1-cost, maybe some 2-cost cards, are going to do 2 or 3 or 4 damage. Probably in the 2 to 3 range. Most of the ones that we found are really strong are in there. And so if your card has, call it 3 willpower, character challenges you, does 2 damage, you remove 1 of them, you're still dead next turn.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's great to have it on the board, but
I just think it's overrated a little bit.
Same thing with other cards within the amber ink. You have Healing Glow as an action, so you use it once and it's gone. It costs 1, it removes 2 damage.
That's a little bit more so, I think. I think that's a little bit more useful than Dinglehopper.
It is a little bit more useful, but again, it's still very limited because you get to use it once.
Yep.
And it's done at that point.
Very niche.
The character, so the legendary Rapunzel, gifted with healing, from her hair from the movie. Shout out Rapunzel fans. When you play that card, you get to remove 3 damage from each of your characters. So that's like super overpowered.
That's obviously the best one.
And you get to draw a card for each damage you removed. So that's an incredible card. But again, you will have had to really devise a strategy where you have a couple damaged cards on the board, or it's useless because it's when you play it. So if you play it and you don't have any damage on the board, then it doesn't do you anything, and it's just another card. And so it's very situational, and you have to really synergize the deck around that ability to make it work well.
Yeah, and I just don't think for Amber there's a lot of things that work with that super well necessarily. So it just...
Agree.
It's very situational.
I like the thought of healing a lot.
Yes.
There's a lot of passive abilities that cards have to deal damage. Hans and Steel, for instance, we talked about that on the tier list. Like when he quests, he deals 1 damage.
Mm-hmm.
There need to be passive characters that have some sort of healing ability for when they quest or when they challenge themselves to keep themselves alive longer or keep their other teammates alive. And I don't know how that looks. Like, I'm definitely not a game designer, but I think they, in our current state, I don't feel like they've fully thought out the healing yet.
And again, we still are in the very beginning. We're in the first chapter. So all these things we talked about could change, as the months go by.
And and again, I think I've said this already this episode. If we are wrong and you have an incredible healing deck, please let us know. I want to build a cool healing deck. I genuinely do.
We're open-minded to changing our opinions about anything here.
Yeah, we'd love to have somebody come in, counter us, and show us why we're wrong.
Yeah.
And learn and grow and get better from it. So, yeah, I think that kind of covers the main points that a new player could ask or could have.
Yep, 100%. I think, and again, we have these past 48 hours basically of just playing the game, and these are all the things that we've learned basically.
We dove in. We had an episode that's out now that we dove in to some of the basics on how to play the game. So if you're a new character and you're wanting some of the basics on what to do on your turn, how to set your turn up, how to start your turn, how to interact with the cards and the damage counters and the lore and everything along those lines, you should go check out that episode too. And then once you have a really good handle on the game, come back to this and dive a little bit deeper into the strategies and how to build out a really strong deck and what to consider when doing so. Any last topics, suggestions, thoughts?
I think, like I just said, I think all these things could change. I just think that's the biggest thing to take away. And I think that's the funnest part about it is we could have all these things that we're saying now that could change in the next few months. We have Chapter 2 coming out, I think, about November time.
End of November, beginning of December for card shops / national retailers. But yeah, so we got a couple months, and by then we'll have a lot of stuff changed, I imagine, and Chapter 2 could change everything on its head.
Yep, so stay tuned to the podcast here, and we'll keep you up to date on all this.
If you want to reach out or have any questions or comments or want to suggest deck ideas to us or correct us where we're wrong, please do. You can email us at lorcanapod@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, the same handle, at lorcanapod. We have YouTube videos for all the podcast episodes as well, and other unboxing videos on our YouTube channel at Illumineers Quest on YouTube, and you can find us syndicated on every podcast network that you like. So thanks for tuning in, and if you have any questions, please reach out.
All right, see you guys.
Until next time, bye.